On today's program, we'll hear an interview conducted by Mark Baldwin back in 1992 with Professor Noam Chomsky of MIT, world-renowned linguist and political analyst, who's written extensively about the role of the press in contemporary society.
This is Mark Baldwin, and today we are talking with Dr. Noam Chomsky, who is professor of languages and linguistics at MIT, and as we hope you know, is one of the century's, I think, one of the century's most perceptive and most clear political analysts. He is here at the University of Maine speaking in the Distinguished Lecture Series, and will, by the way, receive a honorary doctorate of humane letters from the university. You've often explained how loaded is the context of mainstream media news. Do you see any signs of changes in that lately?
Well, it depends how narrowly you construe lately. I think there are changes over about a 30-year period. I think there's been a broadening and a loosening of the constraints, opening up to marginally different perspectives. I wouldn't say that it's much, but I think it's detectable. And I think that's just a reflection of things going on in the larger society. The society has become more skeptical, more dissident, more open, and the media can't fail to at least marginally reflect that. So you have a range of opinion expressed and issues considered that would have been dismissed or eliminated 30 years ago. I think there are many illusions about what the media were like in the 60s. So people think of the media at that time as being, say, anti-war or anti-establishment and so on. That's just absolutely not true. They were passionately committed to the Vietnam War, virtually without exception. On other issues of the day, the same is true. It's only by comparison the debate over Central America, though very narrow and restricted, was considerable. Media didn't begin to turn against the war until well after Wall Street decided the game wasn't worth the candle. I mean, in early 1968, in fact, every study shows that. Not only were the media very pro-war, but they even increased hawkishness among the general population. That goes right through the Tet Offensive in early 68. After the Tet Offensive, which demonstrated to U.S. elites that the war was going to be a long business. It wasn't going to be easy to crush the Vietnamese. It was going to be costly and lengthy, and it was going to harm the U.S. economy. By about early 68, you got a strong elite opposition to the war on purely tactical grounds. We ought to liquidate the enterprise because we've essentially achieved what we wanted, and it's just becoming too costly. And about a year and a half after that, you started getting people called dissidents in the media, like, say, Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, writing their first timid criticisms of the war. There's tremendous illusions about that. It was funny to read the reviews of James Reston's recent autobiography. Almost every, he was the leading commentator for the New York Times, and just about every review talked about how passionately he was opposed to the war and so on. You go back and read what he was writing. He sounded like a madman. I mean, he was talking about how the war was ordered by God, right, and we were fighting for the Creator and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's just a joke. Now it's bad enough now, but better than it was. Same on other issues. I mean, take say issues like racism and sexism. They are now. It's possible for the media to deal with them. In the 60s, they would have simply been dismissed or disregarded as absurd or something. If Anita Hill had come out with her testimony about harassment 30 years ago, people would have just laughed. This time, when it was leaked, it was necessary to pay some attention to it at least. And you could get a discussion in both ways in the media. That would certainly not have been true 30 years ago.
So now it's fashionable to say that the electorate, that the people are interested in more substantive things. Do you think this is true? Is it a new fad? Is this does it go back and forth between the media and the people?
Well, I think population is always interested in substantive things, things that relate to their interests and concerns, and for most people that can be very broad, but they're not presented with it. The media, first of all, the media, when we talk about the media, we're kind of oversimplifying because they're not uniform. They have various functions and they're diverse. So the function of the sports pages and the function of the editorial columns is not the same. And similarly, the media, there are different types of media. Just as a first approximation, there are what we might call the agenda-setting media. Papers like, say, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the news weeklies and the main news programs on the television channels and so on. They set a kind of a framework to which the other media more or less adapt. So if you're a small, an editor in, Boise, Idaho or something like that, or, Laramie, Wyoming, chances are you will, to the extent that you cover foreign news or major national news at all, which is usually small, to that extent the editor will probably adapt to what the New York Times did that morning. In fact, if you take a look at the AP wires every afternoon, they sort of grind out stories at a massive rate. Around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there's a break in the stories, and something comes along which is directed to editors. It says something like "Notice to editors," and then it said tomorrow's New York Times. The New York Times is considering the following stories for the front page tomorrow. Okay, you're an editor of a newspaper somewhere. You read that, and you say, "Well, that's the news." As long as the New York Times is covering it, I can't get into any trouble if I cover it. On the other hand, if I use my own judgment and pick up some other story, well, I'm kind of vulnerable, and how am I going to support it? And I don't have the resources to pursue it, and so on. So it's not 100. And then the framework. In fact, if even the television channels, the night evening news, it's well known that they adapt themselves to what appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal that morning. Because you don't want to take any chances. Anyhow, it's easier. Just as it's easier to get your story from the government than to get your story from, the peace movement or something, or from a corporation, So just quite apart from any ideological considerations, and those are strong too, there's a lot of pressure to adapt to what the major media set as the framework, and they understand that. Take something like, say, the New York Times book review, the weekly book review. Well, the editors of the New York Times understand perfectly well that has an overwhelming influence on what books will survive. Again, you're a librarian in Des Moines, Iowa. How are you going to decide what books to buy? Well, you'll take a look at the New York Times book review and see what they think is worth buying. So the New York Times is particularly important in this respect, and they know it. They're determining history, they're determining taste, they're determining perception, they're setting up a framework to which others will adapt, and therefore their commitment to indoctrination and ideological conformity is very high. Now, other sectors of the media play quite a different role. Also, these media, these agenda-setting media, are typically directed to a kind of an elite audience. The readership for, say, the Times and the Post and Wall Street Journal and so on are people in what you might call a managerial position. It could be political management or economic management or cultural management, like educators and so on, or professionals, or people who somehow play an active role in deciding how the society works. Now, this is the agenda-setting media. Now, what we call the mass media, the ones that really reach a mass audience, they're quite different. I say sitcoms on TV, or much of what appears in the press, which is, women's pages and sports pages and, this and that, arts and that sort of thing. That's mainly directed to diversion. Just keep the public out of trouble. Keep the public away from paying attention to anything about what's going on in the world. Let them watch the football games, then they won't bother us. And in fact, or trivia, like take for example this latest flap about the Congress and the checks. all right, it's probably bad. But, I mean, on the scale of problems in the country, it is so small that you can't even find it, on the scale of, say, corporate crime, I mean, it's undetectable. But it's a good target. It's a good way to divert people's attention from real issues and make them anti-government, and maybe you can use that anti-government feeling to cut down on social spending and so on. So there are factors like that. But a very large part of the media is simply diversion or else creation of conformist attitudes. So take a look at, say, commercial advertising. Remember, we have a public relations industry, which is a huge affair. I mean, it's a private industry, so you can't get any information about it, but it probably spends over $1 billion a year, as they themselves put it, in order to control the public mind. They're very much interested in controlling people's attitudes and values and beliefs and thoughts and so on. They put tremendous effort into it and a lot of thought into it. Advertisements, shaping of programs, sitcoms. I mean, even a lot of the news is just fashioned and created by public relations industries. They sometimes even now the big ones call themselves public affairs industries, like Hill and Knowlton, which got a little notoriety a while back because they faked a lot of the news about Kuwait atrocities in Kuwait, even a front page story and TV guide about it. They call themselves a public affairs institution. They're just in the business of helping the public. Well, they're helping the public see the world from the point of view of their corporate and state clients. And if that requires faking news, fine. If that requires organizing sitcoms on television which provide people with an ideal of life to which they must aspire, which involves individual consumption and self-interest and lack of concern for others and becoming a kind of an isolated atom and so on, well, yeah, then they'll do that. And all of this is that. Now we're really talking about mass media. Things like spectator sports is a perfect.
Well, the notion that there really isn't a lot of difference between the sports pages and the so-called front page of the Times, you don't see it like that. You see it as much more thoughtful than that. You see a real purpose to the kind of quote news that we get.
There are things in common too, but they're directed to different audiences. The front page of the New York Times, a large part of it is trying to build up chauvinist attitudes of subordination to state and corporate power. Now, the sports pages have something similar about them, but in a different way. I mean, after all, why should anybody cheer for the home team? Look, I remember in high school, I was a high school kid, and it suddenly dawned on me, why am I cheering for my football team? I don't know anybody on the football team, they don't know me. We couldn't talk to each other for 3 seconds. They're probably professional athletes who were brought in from somewhere so we can beat up guys somewhere else. We have nothing in common. I don't care about this high school. I don't want to be in it. It's just that I have to get to college. Why am I cheering for the high school football team? And I was all excited about it. Terrible if we lose, great if we win, and so on. Well, when you think about it for a minute, it's just a way of instilling the most horrifying attitudes of subordination to power and authority in people. I mean, you've got to cheer for your home team because that's you, and they represent you, and that translates over into cheering for your government and cheering for whoever else orders you around. But from my point of view as a human being, what do I care if these guys win or the guys on the other side of the field win? It's got nothing to do with me. Also, the increasing violence of sports, I think, is significant. I mean, when I was a kid, basketball used to be a non-contact sport. You watched it because of or you played it, or you did something or other. I mean, now it's mayhem, and I think that's also building up attitudes of the importance of violence and beating people and but anything but solidarity and cooperation and compassion and sympathy and working together for some purpose. And so you can translate quickly from cheering for your high school. In fact, it's kind of interesting to watch these sports metaphors. It was pretty striking in the Kennedy administration. These guys who regarded themselves as intellectuals, all from Harvard and so on, they didn't just call themselves intellectuals. They were action intellectuals, a new breed of action intellectuals. They're going to really show how to do things. And they were constantly using things like sports metaphors. That gets into people's bones. But there are also other aspects to it. So, when I drive around in the city, I often turn on the radio just to talk programs, just to hear what people are talking about. Now, you listen to a talk program at random. A lot of them are just, how to make money or something, get along with your boyfriend or something. But if they're not that, they're mostly sports. In fact, there was a station in Boston, a big station. I think it used to be the CBS radio station that used to be all news. Now it's all sports. And most of it is talk. And if you listen to the talk, it's kind of interesting in a way. For one thing, it's interesting because of the expertise of the people who call in. The people who call in are, they really know things, Like they don't hesitate to second guess the coach of the Boston Patriots, whoever they are. They know better than he did what he ought to do. Now, they don't talk about politics because that's not their business. Now, they don't talk about how to run their company because that's not their business. They just take orders. In all their lives, they take orders. You take orders from the corporation, the business, the boss, the state, everything else. But there's one place where they don't take orders, and that is, who's going to pitch for the Red Sox tomorrow. So that they know all about, and they have tremendous information, and they put all their intelligence into that. And that's safe, because then they're not affecting people with power. They're wasting and exhausting their time and energy and intelligence in things which allow the rich people to run the world the way they want to without being disturbed. And I think there's a function to that, too.
On this question of directing thought through the media as a conscious thing, I guess I was about 16 when I started as a copy boy in a big city newspaper, and it was pretty clear immediately to me that censorship was self-motivated. The other thing that was clear was that the news was about authority, because I could write anything in the little stories they gave me if I said authority said, or if I quoted authority, so that was the news. There's an authority. In my years in journalism, never personally was in a meeting in which it was pieces were directed. A story conference said, we're going to have this on for a reason, for a stated reason. Though I wrote an article for the New York Times, and they simply inserted something which was clearly just a little piece of fabric in there. It was totally made up. It was just a piece of fabric and I don't know, I tried to find out where it came from, and nobody would ever tell me. Are you saying that at some level there is a discussion in the boardroom, in the editors' meeting of the New York Times and the Washington Post, in which they say, we're going to do this for this reason?
Well, there is a discussion. Everybody knows that. At some time in the afternoon, the top editors get together and decide what's going to be where, and that's a discussion. However, I doubt very much that they say, well, we better suppress this because it would be harmful to state interests or corporate interests. The point is, you don't even make it to the position where you can enter into those discussions unless you've already demonstrated your loyalty so completely that the issue won't arise. You've got to have internalized the values of subordination before you ever get into the system. It's pretty much the same in academic life. And if people begin to veer a little bit, which is rare, they'll be given many ways to understand that they're going off. Like, suppose you're a young reporter, and you start pursuing a local story, say, that the editor realizes is not going to be good for advertising. Say, I want to take a small point. Chances are, if he's a good editor, he's not going to come in and say, look, you can't do that story. We're going to lose our, so-and-so isn't going to advertise. What you'll be told is, well, I think you need a little more experience. You're a little bit emotional. You don't seem to, why don't you go to the metro, to a police court, and learn how to write a story better and that sort of thing. And after you've sort of gotten the point, then you can come back and try again. There's a million things like this. I'm sure you must have seen it. First of all, everybody sees it in their own education. If you've gone through school, this has happened to you 10,000 times. I mean, you hand in a composition or let's say a history class, you'll get it back. The teacher in school isn't going to say you got the wrong ideology, but there are ways of hinting to you and indicating to you that you're not thinking about it the way you ought to be thinking about it. You ought to do it a little differently. Actually, my daughter went to she wanted to be a real crusading journalist at one point, and she went off to a real high-class journalism school, and I asked I mentioned this to one of my friends who's a top television correspondent, and very cynical. A lot of the people in the media understand this system perfectly, try to manipulate it to their purposes, and he just laughed when I told her she was going to journalism school. He said they're going to teach her how to write nothing in 700 words, and that's pretty much what it was like. I mean, if she handed in papers that got too deeply into the issue or had a little background, she'd get back notes saying too cerebral, or be more objective, and various things that meant just, look at the surface, don't ask any questions, go to the right authorities, don't pursue things in directions where you might be analyzing too much and being too critical. But nobody ever said, keep to the party line. And nor did the teacher think of it that way. I mean, you don't make it to the point where you're giving those directions until you've internalized the values. I mean, you ask, occasionally I do a lot of published criticism of the media, and occasionally there's a reaction. And it's I usually criticize the liberals, because I think they're the more interesting ones. I mean, they're the ones who set the outer limits of criticism. They say this far and no further. They're the real dissidents, can't go farther than me, Daniel Shore, Tom Wicker, and so on. And they regard themselves as very adversarial. I mean, I regard them as totally conformist. And a lot of the stuff that I write is criticism of them for their subordination to power. And they get infuriated. I mean, Tom Wicker will write a column about this in which he'll say, look, nobody tells me what to write. I write whatever I feel like. And I agree with him entirely. Because the point is, unless he had already demonstrated his complete subordination to power, and unless he'd shown that it's in his bones, he can't see things any other way, he wouldn't be writing a column. But nobody's going to tell him what to write, that's for sure. It's just that had he been somebody else who'd gone some other way, he'd be working at the police desk somewhere, or else he'd be driving a taxi cab. And there are lots of ways in which this happens. Actually, in my view, it happens from kindergarten on. People often criticize the stupidity of the school system, but I think the stupidity of the school system has a function. It has an important function. I mean, any one of us, I ended up going to good universities. You probably did too. Anybody who ended up going to a good university, if they think honestly about their own lives, they'll recognize that the way they did it was by being very obedient. I mean, every time a teacher gave you some idiotic assignment, you didn't say, I'll be polite, so I won't say what you didn't say. But what you did say is, all right, I'll do it because, who cares, and I'll get to the next grade. Now, there are other guys who did say what I just didn't say, and they would refuse to do it. And they say, it's too crazy, I'm going to do something that makes sense. Now, there's a name for such people. They're called behavior problems. And then you got to take them and treat them and, give them Ritalin or something or other. And later you kind of do something else to them. But the point is that the ones who have been willing to be obedient all their lives and do essentially everything they were told, even if they thought it was ridiculous or a waste of time and so on, the ones who essentially were not independent-minded enough to follow their own course, they'll make it through. And if they're, they've got the right talents or whatever, they'll even make it a long way. And you get a kind of selection for obedience. I think you kind of can I can't prove this, but, I travel around a lot to different places, and I sort of have a sense in the elite colleges that people are very passive in a way. They're very disciplined, and they believe, and so on. And I sort of have a feeling, again, I don't want to claim I can prove it, that there is just a selection for obedience that takes place.
Of course, you were a professor at one of the principal universities you're speaking of? Is it true? You're speaking of personal experience?
Well, I mean, I don't want to. My own personal experience happens to be very exotic, so it doesn't prove much. I mean, I don't have any professional credentials in any field at all, which is why I'm teaching linguistics at MIT. I couldn't have, when I got out of graduate school, I couldn't possibly have gotten a job at any university that had any standards. Because I didn't meet the standards. My students know more than I do about the field. I mean, I was doing my own work and pursuing my own interests, and MIT is a university of science, so they didn't really care if there was any such field. You know, it looked interesting, so take a crack at it. So but that's an unusual experience. I mean, it doesn't mean anything to anyone else. There are tensions inside the universities. See, this system of imposing discipline has extraordinary tensions that are internal to it, and you constantly have to fight against them. So on the one hand, say take MIT, since you mentioned that. It's basically a university of science and engineering. Now, you just have to have creative people. If people aren't creative, you might as well not have the science. It won't be performing its function for anybody, even for the corporate world. So on the one hand, you have to train people to be creative and independent and thoughtful. On the other hand, you have to train them to be obedient and passive. And that's just an internal contradiction. And it's treated in different ways. And there's always that tension you have the same tension in the New York Times. I mean, you do want the journalists to be able to dig out the story and beat out the Washington Post, so they better be enterprising and independent and so on. On the other hand, they also better be obedient and passive because they got to have the party line instilled in them. And that's a contradiction. And you see it, you see it in individuals. You see them sort of trying to work this out for themselves, and people do it in different ways.
This is no joke. You certainly see it in alcoholism in the profession. There's kind of a mini trend that I think I've been hearing, especially in public radio, public television a little bit, where reporters tend to correct so-called misinformation from authorities. It used to be you would only repeat what somebody said, and it wasn't your job to point out something else unless you could find another authority to do it. Have you noticed this, and do you think it means anything? Or it's a kind of an interesting little fad. It's almost like messages on sitcoms, I think.
Well, they correct minor misstatements on minor issues, but major issues nobody discusses. I mean, I don't know, today's morning paper, the lead story happened to be about Libya and the UN. The Libyan sanctions were designed by the United States to be on the anniversary of the bombing of Libya. And there are people who will say now, well, they didn't have very good evidence and so on and so forth. Try to find somebody who say it was a war crime. I mean, suppose Libya bombed us and killed a couple of dozen people because they thought we were involved in some, terrorist action against Libya, and then they decided, well, we weren't. Would that be a mistake? Would we regard that as a mistake? No, we'd regard that as a war crime. We'd say they have to be hanged. Try to find somebody who says that. Or there's a big fuss right now about, alleged Libyan involvement in the Lockerbie bombing. Well, maybe so, maybe not. That's not the only airplane that's been shot down. There are others, or bombed. So, for example, what about there was the worst air tragedy of the decade took place right near Lockerbie, and right in the Irish Sea. It was an Air India flight with 329 people killed. The bombers were traced back to a paramilitary training camp in Alabama, which is used for training mercenaries to carry out terrorist activities for the U.S. all over the world. They happen to be Indian Sikhs. The U.S. kind of obliquely conceded this. 9 months later, the Attorney General, Edwin Meese at the time, went to India on a trip, and he did say in India that the U.S. would make sure that didn't happen again, meaning it had happened. Well, suppose that suppose we had evidence that people who blew up an American plane had been trained in a training camp in Libya. Would we say, oh, that's amusing, Well, can you find somebody in the United States press who says that the U.S. ought to try Ronald Reagan and George Bush and the rest of those guys for running a paramilitary training camp where they happened to blow up by, they didn't plan to blow this up, but they happened to blow up an airplane. Or let's take another one that's even closer. It's generally assumed that the Lockerbie bombing, whoever did it, was a retaliation for the shooting down of an Iranian Airbus shortly before by a U.S. warship, the USS Vincennes. Well, in the British press, I happened to notice a letter the other day in which someone said that Libya should hand over the accused terrorists, and they should hand them over to the same court that tried the commander of the Vincennes for shooting down the Iranian Airbus. Well, try to find some correspondent who'll point that out, or he'll even give you the background. Let me add something about the background, which is well known but suppressed here. Whenever that's referred to, it's called an accidental bombing. Okay, well, is it an accidental bombing? That's not everybody's opinion. Certainly not Iran's opinion. For example, Iran has tried to bring a case against us to the World Court, charging us with terrorism. The U.S., of course, refuses jurisdiction. The World Court can't do anything to us. We're too big for that. Try to find a report on that. Or to take something even more striking, the commander of there was a naval commander, U.S. naval commander named David Carlson, was commanding a nearby vessel right next to the Vincennes, and he had an article in the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings, major naval department journal, in which he describes what happened as it looked to him from the deck of his vessel right next door to the Vincennes. And he says something like, "We wondered aloud in disbelief as we watched the commander of the Vincennes aim his missiles at what was obviously a commercial airliner in a commercial airspace, apparently out of an interest in trying out his new high-tech Aegis missile system, and then he shot it down." Well, that's kind of interesting. Another thing that's interesting is George Bush's reaction to it. He gave the commander of the Vincennes the Legion of Merit Award for the calm and professional atmosphere on board his plane when he shot down the Iranian airliner. He also gave the Legion of Merit Award to the deck officer in charge of anti-air warcraft. Well, here's a few things that might be mentioned which raise some questions about terrorist actions. Or let's take, say, extradition. Big fuss about extraditing the two Libyans. Well, there are other extradition cases that are alive right now. Just a couple of months ago, New Zealand tried to get Switzerland to extradite a French Secret Service agent who they claimed was involved in the blowing up of the Rainbow Warrior, a ship that was blown up in a New Zealand harbor. France concedes that the French government blew that ship up, killing somebody. It was a Greenpeace ship that was going to interfere with their nuclear testing. New Zealand tried to push the issue, but France just warned them that if they pushed the issue, they'd ensure that they'd cut off trade relations, and New Zealand wouldn't survive that. Now New Zealand is trying to get Switzerland to extradite a French terrorist from Switzerland. Well, France put extensive pressure on Switzerland to make sure they didn't send that man back. Well, it's France who's standing up in the Security Council making speeches about how Libya has to do it. Or take the United States. Right now, in fact for several years, Costa Rica has been trying to get us to extradite an American terrorist, John Hull, a man who's accused in Costa Rica. It's a democratic country with whom we have extradition treaties. They accused him of premeditated murder, drug trafficking, participation in a bombing of a press conference in which 5 or 6 people were killed, and using his land for terrorist war against Nicaragua. In fact, they renewed that request right in the middle of all the flap about Libya. I couldn't find anybody who would even report it. Well, when you talk about correcting errors, sure, somebody misstates something, they'll correct it. But these aren't minor errors. These are the kinds of things you'd expect in a totalitarian state, and nobody's going to correct them.
You were mentioning a lot of information which you got somewhere. And you cited a bunch of sources which are either more or less available, but all of them available to anybody who wants it. Toward the end of the war in Vietnam, it was common to say, well, we didn't know this or that. There was, now we're against it because previously we didn't have the right information. And of course, there always was virtually all of the information available that there is now. There are only a few things that so-called come out. Can you describe, for somebody who wants to be informed, how to do that? I mean, what is, naming places, naming things to read, naming what you read, and perhaps talking a little about how to read, how to know what you're reading, how to read a little between the lines. What is a positive thing that people can do to avoid in 5 years saying we didn't know and being willfully ignorant?
Well, you have to be a bit of a fanatic. So take the things I just mentioned, for example. The French pressure on Switzerland not to extradite a French terrorist actually received a sentence in the New York Times. There was an op-ed by a British academic outlining the Libyan legal case, and in sort of, toward the end of it, he had a couple of sentences in which he mentioned this. Well, if you notice that, you immediately see something. The case of John Hull, well, that's been all over the Central American press, which of course people can't read, and it's been. But I happened to pick it up off the AP wires, meaning every journalist in the country who wanted it had it. The story about the tracing back the bombing of the Air India flight to the Alabama camp, that was discussed in a book by Leslie Coburn called Out of Control. She was a CBS, I think, reporter who now does investigative reporting. She has things on Frontline with her husband, Andrew Coburn. She had a very good book called Out of Control on the U.S. government involvement in drug peddling in Central America, and she happened to dig this one up. The business about Edwin Meese going to India, I picked up off the AP wires again. And we can run through case after case. It's always somewhere in the mainstream. In fact, sometimes, take, say, Vietnam, every American ought to know that the United States attacked South Vietnam in 1962. That's the year in which U.S.-run international terrorism escalated to outright flat aggression. And you could read that on the front page of the New York Times. I think it was around October 1962, the New York Times, I remember reading it, I could look up the date, had an article, I think it was a front page article, which said the U.S. Air Force, or U.S. pilots, are now conducting 30% of the bombing raids against South Vietnam. They said Viet Cong, but that means South Vietnamese villages. So that means U.S. Air Force is conducting 30% of the bombing of South Vietnamese villages, and the other 70% are being conducted by U.S. clients in U.S. planes with U.S. advisors in them. Well, if that isn't aggression, then the word doesn't have any meaning. Okay, everybody read that story, and nobody saw that it was aggression. Now, that's the real problem. The real problem is you can sort of observe it, but not see it. I remember once my friend and co-author Edward Herman, who does a lot of this work, had an article in a journal called Lives of Our Times on the U.S. coverage of the Salvadoran elections. And the coverage was very upbeat, what terrific elections they were, and so on, because they're in a U.S. client state, so therefore automatically they're wonderful. And he happened to have a picture. There was a photo there taken by some freelance American journalist, and it was a picture of a voting booth which had a transparent, kind of like lucite or something, box, and right standing next to it was a Salvadoran soldier, and people were putting their thing in there with an X drawn. Well, if you know anything about El Salvador, you vote the wrong way, you're going to end up torn to pieces in a ditch 3 days later with your brains blown out or something. So here's a free election, in which people are putting marked ballots into a transparent voting box with the Salvadoran army standing there and looking at it. And there was an American reporter standing there taking notes or something, and the caption under the picture was something like, they observe it, but they don't see it, Well, that's the problem. There are a lot of things we They pass before our eyes, but we don't see them. Because in order to see them, you have to have an understanding of what it means. You have to be able to you have to have enough, you have to use your intelligence, you have to use your skepticism, your natural understanding, so that you can look at the data that's passing before your eyes and see what it means. Now, nobody's going to organize it for you that way because they don't want you to understand what it means. Now, to do this individually is very hard. About the only way in which, fanatics can do it. But ordinary people can't do it. You don't have that time, you don't have the energy, you can't think about it, you got a life to lead, and so on. And that's why people organize. If you do things together with other people, then you can do it.
Not to take away from somebody's responsibility to find out how to hear and see, but can you suggest any sources, any publications, any broadcasts that you think give either a straight factual or a useful analysis, or both?
Well, straight factual is a funny word. Anybody who's talking is talking from some point of view. Like, I'm talking from a point of view. If you're honest, you make it clear what your point of view is. If you're dishonest, you claim you're being just neutral and objective. So what you have to do is look at a wide range of stuff. Now, what you're getting from the mass media is a very narrow range of material from a very particular, rather extremist ideological perspective. And one way to deal with that is just to read extremely critically, like I've been saying. But another way to deal with it is to sort of triangulate, get other sources. In fact, there are other sources. Now, the kind of thing I'm talking about, for example, there's plenty of material in print of exactly this kind. There are magazines like, say, Zeta magazine, which comes out of Boston, which is every month presenting a different point of view on the world. Virtually anything that Alex Coburn writes for, a column in The Nation or somewhere else, is presenting a different point of view of the world. There are journals like Lies of Our Times, monthly journal that comes out of New York, which is media critique, and constantly is producing material like this. F.A.I.R, which is a media organization of media critique, they put out a journal called Extra once a month, which again is constantly picking things out like this. And there are other sources. A journal like, say, The Guardian in New York gives you a different picture of the world. In These Times in Chicago is a weekly, which gives you a somewhat different picture. If you're interested in particular issues, like take, say, Central America. There was a huge amount of interest in Central America during the 80s, and for good reason. The solidarity groups, many of them church-based groups, put out a huge amount of information, which was completely unavailable in the mass media. Very expert, very knowledgeable. I remember going down to places like, Manhattan, Kansas, and finding groups of people who knew more about Central America than any academic department or the CIA or anyone like that, because they were involved in groups that just were directly involved and concerned and went down and so on. It's not simple, but there are sources that will give you a very different picture. Community radio makes an enormous difference. Every place I've ever been, I travel around a lot. You can almost sense the difference when you go into a town that has community radio and one that doesn't. Community radio often just gives, not only does it give alternative perspectives, but if it's well done, it also gives people ways of communicating among themselves and even participating. And it does it on a regular daily basis, not once every 6 months. Like, maybe once every 6 months NPR will have 2 minutes of something that sort of breaks out of the mainstream. Well, that doesn't help much, It has to be on a regular, continuing basis, so you sort of build up understanding and you develop ways of looking at things. And alternative press, or often community radio, do provide ways of doing that. But the primary way of doing it is to be part of something. Alone, it is very hard. You look at the tube alone, and you may think whatever you think, but your assumption can only be, I must be crazy. In fact, it's kind of interesting to look at, if you look at polls, it's very striking to find out how opposed public opinion is to public policy on issue after issue. Take, say, right before the Gulf War. there was a big issue. There's only one issue, major issue, before a war, and that is, should we go to war? That issue was never discussed in the United States in the mainstream, never. I mean, they claim they discussed it, but they're just not telling the truth. The issue was, shall we pursue the option for a diplomatic settlement, or shall we go to war? That issue was not discussable. The president had said there will be no negotiations, and the media marched in a parade without asking any questions, no negotiations. Now, there were diplomatic options. They were suppressed. In fact, I know of only one newspaper in the United States that even reported the facts, Newsday on Long Island. Occasionally you'd get a hint of them somewhere else, and of course they were in the alternative press. Nevertheless, despite the fact that the issue had never been discussed, and nobody had advocated publicly, or almost nobody, diplomacy over negotiations, nevertheless, right up until the war, about two-thirds of the public on polls, 2-1, was saying they favored a settlement which involved Iraqi withdrawal in the context of an international conference on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Well, you try to find somebody in the media who'd advocated that. I doubt if there was, maybe 1/100th of 1% of the commentary advocated that. Furthermore, the people who said yes on that question, 2-1, probably none of them knew that just a week before, Iraq had made an offer to withdraw in just those terms, and it had been flatly turned down by the United States. Well, the people who answered that question, you try to imagine what they must have had in their minds. They must have said, look, I'm going to say this even though I'm crazy. Nobody else is saying it. Nobody's discussing the possibility of it, so I'm crazy, but that's what I think. Well, in that case, two-thirds of the public was crazy. And if they'd known the facts, it probably would have been 98% of the public. That's the media doing their job, making sure that everybody's alone, that nobody ever has ways of interacting with one another or has the relevant facts at their hand. So therefore, when the president goes to war, they'll say, well, we had to go to war. That's success. That's a media success, in my opinion, the kind of success you would get in a well-run totalitarian state. What's interesting about the United States is that you get it in a free society.
You were noticeably absent as a commentator on McNeil-Lehrer and All Things Considered. I think I've heard you once or twice on McNeil-Lehrer, right? I got that one time, right? So, why is that? I mean, we know the answer in a way, but do you? I know that people suggest that you are one of their softball hitters, be one of their hitters. Do you ask them? Do you get, why aren't you? What contact do you have? What personal effort do you make to take this message and point of view of yours into the media that you've been talking about?
Well, the question you ought to ask is why I was on once. And the reason I was on once was very simple. At the end, I'm guessing, I don't look into their minds, but I think I understand. Iraq invaded Kuwait in early August 2nd, 1990. For about a month, there wasn't a whisper of criticism of U.S. policy. You just couldn't find anybody who would even say there could be some possible alternative to what George Bush is doing. Now, McNeil-Lehrer tried to make it look at least as if there's some discussion going on. So they had to find somebody who would make a critical comment. And in fact, during that period, they really had to reach down to the dregs. They had me on, they had Erwin Knoll on, they had Edward Said on. They really, the only people they could find who would say anything moderately critical were people who are so far out of their spectrum that they'd never talk to them. That's why I was on the one time. Now, do I ask them about it? Of course not. I understand. They may not understand, but I understand perfectly well. In fact, I recall on that discussion, whichever one of them it was, interviewed me, said, that of course I'd been on many times, and I corrected him and said, no, this is the first time I'd ever been on. And he said, oh, that's impossible. We must have had you on lots of times. They probably think they did, because they think of themselves as very open. Same with NPR and Daniel Shore and the rest of them. But the fact is that they wouldn't, that it's just impossible for them. Now, when you say it was very dramatic for me personally, right during the Gulf War, because I was down at the Boston radio and television stations all the time for overseas broadcasts. I mean, I would be down at the PBS station all the time for Australia, or Sweden or something like that. In fact, I was on national radio all over the world constantly. I couldn't fill all the requests because they wanted some commentary. Actually, the reason they were coming to me, why are they coming to me? Because their own countries are very similar to the United States. Their own educated classes are just as conformist as those here, and they won't make any criticism. So if they wanted some, but the media are somewhat more open there. So if they wanted a criticism, they had to find these kind of strange guys in the United States who were willing to talk. So in fact, I was probably on Australian television about 100 times as much as I was on American radio outside of community radio stations, and the same with Canada and Europe and so on. The United States, they're very careful. And I think it's understandable. This is a very free society. You got to be extremely cautious not to let people get any ideas in their head. If you have a society where people are kind of disciplined and obedient and controlled and so on, it doesn't matter too much what they think. If you have a place where people tend to be sort of independent and, they don't like to be ordered around, and their state doesn't have a lot of power to coerce people and so on, which is true of the United States, you have to be extremely cautious that nobody thinks. So it's in countries like this, which are very free. Not only the country's free and that the state can't control you, like they can't send the cops in to stop this discussion, but also people happen to be pretty independent-minded and tend not to like to be kicked around, and less obedient than in many other cultures. In places like this, you have to be super cautious about what reaches people. So I understand I think the ideological system is, again, doing its job.
One of your bottom line analyses is often that it's okay to criticize the government because it's like sports or something, but it's corporate power that is the motor. And well, now I'm a small businessman. I have a little publishing company, and I want to. Do you have lines on that? I mean, I'm responsible for a small corporation. What do you mean by corporate power?
Corporate power? Well, the first question you ask about any society, if you want to understand how it works, doesn't matter what it is. It can be, primitive tribe or, major industrial power. First question you ask about it is, who decides how the place works? Who decides what's produced, what's distributed, what's available, what the conditions of work are? I mean, the core elements of any society are what keeps people alive, and how they function and how they work. So who makes that decision in the United States? Well, it's made by what we would call a fascist system. A business, small or large, is the economic equivalent of fascism. Power is from the top down. It goes from the owner down, to the owner, to the manager, to the worker. There's no flow of power from bottom up. There's no flow of decision-making from bottom up. Furthermore, small businesses are, they don't have much decision-making range. But you go up to the Fortune 500, and you're getting to huge systems of power. I mean, they're more powerful than most states. And what's more, they're highly integrated. They don't work alone. They're integrated with banks and with each other and with other, investment firms and so on. And furthermore, they have another instrument of power. It's called the government, which they largely dominate. Either they staff the top decision-making positions themselves, or they set conditions that they have to meet. Like, for example, take the British elections the other day. Everybody's surprised. The Conservatives won. Well, anyone who was reading the Financial Times, the main business newspaper in England, they knew the Conservatives were going to win. All you had to do is look what was happening to the stock market and to the investment flow. You just track it. As Labor's popularity rose, capital flight rose along with it, meaning people sending their capital abroad, and the stock market declined along with it. Well, intellectuals, have the privilege of not paying any attention to what happens in the world and making up fairy tales. That's their job. But ordinary people have to live, you know. I mean, ordinary people know that if they're going to vote the wrong way, their country's going to collapse because the guys who own it are going to kill it. I mean, the people who own the country are not going to allow it to run unless they govern it. You know, people may not, I don't know how sophisticated their formulation of this may be, but you know it in your bones. If they vote the wrong way, the people who actually decide how the country works are going to put their money somewhere else. And in fact, the day the Conservatives won, the British pound shot up through the stratosphere. It had its huge amount of capital began flowing right back into England because of what's called business confidence. It means now businessmen are going to be rich and let alone again, so everything's fine. I mean, at some level, I think most people understand that if you're a homeless person in the streets of, say, New York, your highest priority is to make sure that the rich folk in the mansions are happy. Because if they're not happy, since they decide what happens in the country, and they make the decision, you know, they decide what's going to be produced and where investment's going to be and everything else. If they're not happy, you're not even going to get crumbs. So you better make sure they're happy first. Well, you know, that's how the country works, basically. I mean, it's more complicated than that. And at some level, I think most people understand it. Well, you know, those are the kind of topics you can't try to find something discussing. These things are truisms. I mean, they ought to be taught in 8th grade because they're so obvious. I mean, you want to get more complicated, you wait until high school. But these are truisms. Try to find somebody who ever talk about these things in the media. Impossible.
That was linguist and political analyst Noam Chomsky of MIT, interviewed by Mark Baldwin when Professor Chomsky visited the University of Maine to deliver a talk and to receive an honorary doctorate from the university back in 1992.